Welcome to this edition of Inside America's Boardrooms. I'm TK Kerstetter, and I'll be your host for today's show. Once again, we are handling this show remotely, like the rest of the world. And we're trying during this remote period to cover topics and challenges that a board of directors has during the COVID-19. And today we're going to be talking about how COVID-19 crisis impacts cyber risk and digital transformation. And joining me is Christa Steele, who's a board member with OFG Bancorp, is a former CEO of a publicly held bank, and regularly speaks on digital disruption, artificial intelligence, big data, and predictive analytics. Welcome, Christa.
Thank you for having me.
So there's no question that this is a time with a ton of distractions for the board of directors and for companies themselves. A lot's going on. It's not hard to be sort of taken out of your flow. And to me, it's funny that 4 months ago, every other strategic word out of business advisors' mouths was digital transformation. Yet today, you don't hear anybody talking about digital transformation. And what's particularly funny about that is COVID-19 actually hyped up and put digital transformation on steroids in many industries. So my question to you is, what has COVID-19 meant to cyber risks, data, digital transformation at companies and to the board? And will the pre-crisis plans in this area have to be totally rethought because of what's happened?
I mean, yeah, if you look back, I'd even go back a little further. So I'd say look back 6 or 7 months where we started. And it was with letters from Larry Finks of the world that came out and said, here are the new ESG line in the sand trends that you as directors and you as companies need to be thinking about. That happened. Then we go into a global pandemic. We go into a global recession. And then on top of it all, we have the rise in social injustice that's developed in the last couple of months. So it's just been this convergence of activity that has really made companies be reactive instead of proactive. And you're right that those two buzzwords, digital disruption, went completely out the window. But at the same time, digital disruption went on steroids because a lot of companies moved from literally overnight. A couple of my boards, for instance, went overnight to remote work, where we had 95% of the workforce go remote overnight. So there's been a lot of change, certainly a lot of change. As far as thinking about data, I think that we as directors have started to think about data in a very different way as it's become top of mind. Data is now more valuable than intellectual property, most likely. And we need to think about how data is collected by not only the corporation, but by how it's being collected by outside the corporation, who's interested in it, and how it's being used, both internally and externally. We operate in a world of hyper transparency now, where everything is readily available through social media outlets, etc.
So we're seeing, it's interesting, we're seeing, I don't know if you've seen this, but a number of people are talking about ESG and D, okay? And the D is the data. And first of all, I wish they'd stop with the lumping all the letters together because they don't always relate to each other. But yeah, I've seen a number of places where it's ESG and D.
Yeah, and if you get away from the technical ESG and D, and you really break it down to simplicity, it's really what we've already been doing and what we're striving to do as companies, which is to really think about our stakeholders. And stakeholder is now a broad definition. It used to be thinking about just the shareholder, the almighty shareholder, and that's definitely not the case now. It's people, it's the environment, it's still the shareholder, it's the investor, it's even our vendors, it's the supply chain, etc. So it's really put us all, on our heels in how we evaluate it. And using data, we can leverage all of these points if used appropriately. So data, I think, needs to be in there, ES, AMG, and D. But let's make it simple and let's not make it complicated, because it's really not as complicated as we're trying to make it.
So, what about cyber risk and the risk that was always at the top of the list of every director's concerns because it's so difficult to get your arms around? Well, now all of a sudden, everything's virtual. Mm-hmm. And it would just seem logical that cyber risk has increased. Yet there's so many distractions. I guess it would be a good reminder to boards to make sure that they don't forget about, with all this virtual stuff, that cyber, becomes extremely important.
Yes, I mean, they should be. Right now would be a good time to have the head of information security or the head of IT come in and present and explain what's happened since COVID struck and what changes have been made. There's so many changes being made by management. I mean, early on, I'm on 5 boards, 2 in the educational sector, 1 in financial services and insurance, 1 in waste collection, and the other 1 in agriculture. So I've got a broad portfolio. And each one has responded very differently, but with significant changes that literally happened overnight, where we either had, revenue sources fall off a cliff in some areas, or we just had to completely pivot to make something happen. And with all of that comes inherent risk that has fallen back on the IT folks and overall impacts security and making sure that processes and procedures are being followed, and changes that we've made have been tracked and implemented properly. So it'd be a good time to have these folks come in, make a presentation, talk about what's happened, if there's been breaches, what new activities gone on, and make sure you're locked and loaded in that area.
So one of the things I wanted to do, since we have you here, is I wanted you to sort of look into your crystal ball, and sort of make a prediction, or at least offer advice or guidance. So what advice or guidance would you offer boards who find themselves rethinking the strategic significance of both what's happened to digital and which we haven't talked about, what's happening in AI learning, as they plan for the future?
Well, if you look at the megatrends are all still the same. And those megatrends were things like business models being, pivoting overnight, heightened geopolitical risk, growing social activism, social media-driven hyper-transparency, workforce dynamic changes, things like that. All of that is still present, and it's just magnified right now. And when you think about AI, artificial intelligence, and you think about the future of machine learning, you hear the things like blockchain. What we need to remember is that it's got to be put into the context of the overall plan. Now we've got this on top of it all. We've got the environmental, the social, and the enhanced governance. So it's really a time, I think, where boards and management should sit back down and literally go back to the basics of conversation. Does the corporate strategy still work in this environment? What needs to change? Is it still going to be effective? Because we can't think short term. We have to think long term. There's so much changing. I mean, just think about the real estate footprint of corporate America today. How I think that's going to dramatically change over the course of the next 6 to 12 months, even maybe 24 months, as leases mature and corporations evaluate. Well, this has worked. We've used remote employees, working from home. Do we need this real estate footprint? If you start to even think about the needs versus what you already have going forward, what's that going to look like 12 months from now, 24 months from now? So it's really thinking through long-term planning, and that even comes when you look at doing M&A deals, really getting that acquiring another company. You got to make sure they're going to be viable and sustainable and still be there 5 years from now. And really think about the disruptive forces out of industry. I think we're going to see more and more partnerships between companies that are outside of industry with one another as they look to leverage data and leverage customer engagement. And now we need to be thinking about everything from a delight the customer consumer perspective. And so we really want to understand and dive into what's changing about the buying behavior and the customer behavior.
Well, I can't be surprised at all that these are going to be such major conversations for the board of directors as they sit with management and look on how we continue to adapt to what the new environment is, or even try and guess what the new normal is. So, Christa, I want to thank you for taking the time to join us and offer some guidance. Again, I think this is such a critically important area, and we probably don't devote enough time to some of the challenges. But I appreciate what you were able to offer this morning.
Thank you.
And that will conclude this edition of Inside America's Boardrooms. We hope you enjoyed the show. We'll be back again next week when we take another look at a critical topic that'll help you be a better board member or committee member. So we'll see you then.